very much for joining us. We're going to take a few more minutes just to wait for people to join. In the meantime, if you want to use the chat to introduce yourself, please do. So as we wait for more people to join, I'm just going to quickly run down how this session is going to operate. So we will have a statement by Ms. Moses, and then following that statement, we'll be opening the floor for questions. Obviously, you can also use the webinar chat feature as well to ask your questions. And if you have to leave before the end, please leave your questions there, and then we'll make sure we answer them and then send you the recording following this event. I think we can start it off now, and then I think it'll be fairly easy for anyone else who joins to catch up. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Racquel Moses, the UNFCCC Global Ambassador for SIDS and the CEO of the Caribbean Climate-Smart Accelerator, if you will deliver her statement based off of COP28. The floor is yours, Racquel.
Hello and morning, everyone, or good day wherever you are. I don't know if everybody's made it back from UAE just yet. And here's our statement. The 28th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, COP28, has concluded yesterday, actually, in the United Arab Emirates, marking encouraging steps towards achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. The remarkable and unprecedented final text of COP28 addresses a transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems so as to achieve net zero by 2050. This is significant. Among several notable highlights, including a commitment of over $1 billion by governments and philanthropies to fund methane reduction, were 11 Caribbean countries. Agricultural commitments also got a boost, with 158 countries pledging to mobilize over $2.5 billion to accelerate innovation and climate-resilient solutions for agriculture in the COP28 UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture. From the Caribbean, we had, once again, 11 Caribbean countries and 2 overseas territories endorsing the agreement. The first global stocktake synthesis report by the UNFCCC provides a roadmap for all parties to accelerate their climate action efforts to meet the 1.5 degree target, and the letter from over 1,700 climate leaders and the Later is Too Late campaign, which we were proud to be a part of, created a strong push for the just phase out of fossil fuels, tripling of renewable energy, and doubling of energy efficiency, among other requirements that made it into the final text. While there is still much work to be done, the progress made at COP28 gives us hope. We are especially hopeful given the leadership coming from the Caribbean, which continued to coalesce around one strong voice throughout the COP process. We welcome the proposal for a regional goal on adaptation for the Caribbean, launched by Climate Analytics Caribbean at COP28, and we are proud to see solutions like our own Climate Smart Map, which you can find at map.caribbeanaccelerator.org, gaining traction and emerging as the region takes strong hold of its own future. Some overarching highlights of COP28 are the operationalization of and capitalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, which was a breakthrough consensus on day one. By the end of the summit, this fund has amassed pledges of $792 million to date, because we're hoping for a lot more. Over $2.5 billion was mobilized to protect and restore nature, and many commitments were related to forests, mangrove restoration, and the ocean. The conference highlighted the intersection of health and the climate crisis, introducing its inaugural Health Day, Notably, the COP28 UAE Climate and Health Declaration garnered support from over 120 countries, including Antigua and Barbuda, Costa Rica, Cuba, and Bahamas, marking a pivotal moment in addressing health concerns within climate discussions. Additionally, thematic days showcase the voices of youth and Indigenous peoples, with Caribbean representatives such as Christiane Zakor, Ashley Lashley, Ocean Hamill-Smith, Keon Murray, Vaughan Xavier Jameer, Akil Calendar, and Khadija Stewart, among others, taking center stage. In addition to its pledge of over US 100 million to the new Loss and Damage Fund, COP28 hosts, the UAE also announced a 30 billion new investment vehicle, Altera, with the aim of mobilizing 250 billion of institutional and private capital into climate action by 2030. While fossil fuels were under the microscope at COP28, outside of UAE, Virgin Atlantic had completed a Boeing 747 test flight from London to New York using 100% sustainable energy fuel on November 29th, day one of the summit. The momentum is with us for sustainable air travel, among other lofty goals. The CCSA at COP. To represent the interests of the Caribbean and small island developing states, the Caribbean Climate-Smart Accelerator was represented by a team of three: me, Racquel Moses, UNFCCC Global Ambassador representing small island developing states and the Caribbean, and CCSA CEO, Finance Innovation Director Cheryl Stenhouse, and Director Public Sector Projects Keisha Farnham. Our objectives were three. First, to secure fit-for-purpose financing for climate-resilient projects in the region. We had several fruitful meetings and our investor forum, which we believe will support closing this gap. We also wanted to feature homegrown solutions like the CCSA's new Climate-Smart Map, which was launched to great excitement that will help project developers, philanthropists, and investors take a regional view for addressing our needs. To advocate for the Loss and Damage Fund, which has now been operationalized and beginning to be seriously capitalized. We continue to support global and regional voices calling for climate justice through the speedy establishment of the fund's board and the equitable access to and allocation of funding. In securing fit-for-purpose project financing, our primary focus was to secure financing that aligns with the shovel-worthy projects in need of project preparation support versus shovel-ready projects aimed and primed for investment. To close the climate funding gap, a highlight event in this regard was CCSA's 9th Investor Forum, Resilience in Action, Strategies and Financing for the Future, held at the CARICOM Pavilion. It's also available on our YouTube channel. We featured CCSA-driven lighthouse projects valued at over US $3 billion and pipeline projects from various sources across the organization's 24 implementation countries, valued at over US $10 million. We showcased to investors Marissa Drew, Chief Sustainability Officer, Standard Chartered Bank, James Lindsay, Vice President Investment, Builders Vision, and Tibor Manaj, Vice President Caribbean for HDF Energy. On the renewable energy side, projects presented including the Caribbean Solar Assembly Plant slated for Trinidad and Tobago, the Caribbean Single Energy Export Market, which is a multi-point, multi-directional pipeline of renewable energy, including geothermal, solar, and wind contributed from multiple countries to generate green hydrogen for export. Our Climate-Smart Agriculture project, which was launched earlier this year, is already being piloted successfully in Anguilla, Barbados, and Cayman, which was also presented to be extended to other islands. At the forum, investors gave valuable insights and actionable recommendations, painting a clear picture of the current landscape for investment for climate-resilient projects from their perspective. Post-forum, they have the opportunity to review detailed prospectuses of each project for further deliberation. We also wanted to feature homegrown solutions like our Climate-Smart Map. The Climate-Smart Map demonstrates leadership in global transformation and to showcase that we are capable of homegrown cutting-edge solutions. This data-rich tool pinpoints the main areas of progress and need across CCSA's 28 coalition countries, enabling project curation and entrepreneurship. It's an invaluable tool for investors who need a big picture view of opportunities in the region, while honing in on detail for intricate decision-making. We were also privileged to jointly organize and co-host the COP side event, Green Hydrogen Implementation in the Caribbean, at which Kenneth J. Green Limited of Trinidad and Tobago, represented by Chairman Philip Julian, and regional conglomerate Ansa Macal, represented by Group CEO Anthony Sabga III, signed a landmark memorandum of understanding for cooperation on green energy development in the region. This is another advancement towards a more connected green energy market in the region. Kenneth J. Green Dominica Limited also established an MOU with the government of Dominica for the first large-scale green hydrogen geothermal project in the region earlier this year. This development was further strengthened by the agreement between the government of Dominica and the Dominica Electricity Services and Ormat Inc. to develop the country's 10-megawatt geothermal power plant in Laudat. Other promising developments for the Caribbean at COP: a critical need in the Caribbean has been for project preparation funding to get many worthwhile innovative projects to a state of investment readiness. The CCSA team was pleased to be present for promising developments announced at COP28 in this regard, including the IDB's new One Caribbean program, the GCF's approval of a grant to further develop the BlueCo Caribbean Umbrella Coordination Program. Both programs include project preparation facilities. In the case of BlueCo Caribbean, the grant is aimed at projects in the all-important blue economy. The government of Costa Rica also announced a public-private partnership project preparation facility to leverage public and private sector resources for sustainable infrastructure projects. Vice President Kamala Harris announced that the United States has pledged an additional $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund, which, with over $20 billion in commitments, stands as the largest international fund dedicated to supporting climate action in developing countries. This pledge is in addition to the $2 billion previously delivered by the United States. I'm most proud of the Caribbean solidarity that was a part of COP. What was perhaps most heartening was the level of cooperation and solidarity throughout the conference. This was born through the partnerships established for the comprehensive programming in the CARICOM Pavilion. We joined with the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, the Caribbean Development Bank, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, Segregated Portfolio Company, Climate Analytics Caribbean, the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the Walker's Institute for Regenerative Research, Education and Design, the International Renewable Energy Agency, well in advance of COP28 to see this to fruition. With the CARICOM heads of government having also coordinated before the conference in Grenada, the Caribbean voice in negotiations and on the sidelines was powerful. What does this mean for us, Caribbean people? Well, it certainly means that access to loss and damage is on its way. The devastation that we've seen through Hurricanes Maria, Irma, and Dorian as examples, there is a pathway to recovery through the establishment and operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. The GCF replenishment means that we should expect those projects that have been waiting on GCF funding will progress. And the transition away from fossil fuels puts 1.5 degree within reach. And this, the loss of landmass at bay. Even if we go past 1.5, as predicted by Johan Rocksprung of the Planetary Guardians, the best science framework that we have, we can return to 1.5 as the outer boundary. It also means for oil and gas nations that they should continue their focus on the future of energy with a transition to green hydrogen, green ammonia, and e-methanol as leading products. In closing, moving on from COP28, we are 6 years away from 2030 and at a pivotal point for accelerated action to keep the 1.5 goal within reach. At CCSA, we will continue to work ambitiously to expand on our climate-smart map, secure fit-for-purpose financing for projects that will protect 30% of our land and ocean, see the region reach 90% renewable energy for all by 2035, and usher in a new economy with at least 1.5% new green jobs. We will continue our advocacy for climate justice to protect our vulnerable nations and to secure a viable future for all. As our beloved board co-chair, Uname Gordon outlined in an interview at the Islands of Hope stage at COP28, we look forward to the implementation of a board for the Loss and Damage Fund that has agency to make decisions. And we want to see equitable access to the fund for the recipients for whom it was intended. Vulnerable nations like those in the Caribbean. She also powerfully concluded that COP29 starts on December 13th, 2023. Essentially, the work continues in earnest and with urgency. right now. We invite investors, project owners, and members of civil society to join us on our quest to accelerate the region toward the reality of a climate-smart zone. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Racquel. So I can see that we've got members of the press in the room now. If you want to please add your questions into the Q&A function or also in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to them. We've already got one here from Rena Pierre-Thomas. So what are the economic impacts seen on the plans by the European Union to tax carbon pollution emitted to make goods imported from countries like India and China?
Repeat the question. I just want to make sure I get it.
I think it's the economic impact foreseen on the plans by the EU's carbon pollution tax in terms of the goods imported from countries like India and China.
I think it serves as a catalyst, right? What we want countries to decarbonize their economies, but we also can't pretend that we aren't participating in those economies. So if we aren't paying the full price, including the carbon for those products, then we need to. And I think it's a great move. The economic impact, I think it will be startling at first, but we have long advocated for a price on carbon so that we are actually factoring in the cost of how we operate. And I think it's a necessary progression towards us decarbonizing our economies.
Absolutely. Yeah, please feel free to use the Q&A section here. Got another one from Alison Kentish. So we often look to and encourage youth to get involved in climate solutions. Financing is usually a challenge. Will the CCSA be looking to increase access to financing for young people in the Caribbean?
Absolutely, definitely. And we will be focusing more on supporting the youth in the next year, both in terms of entrepreneurship as well as in terms of access. We operate on a very small staff and a very limited budget, but we see more than any other COP, this last COP, I saw the impact of the youth and their involvement. And it is mandatory that we continue to support youth in advancing projects, in advocacy, and in speaking out on behalf of all of us. So definitely we want to do that.
Yes, and I know on my end, I know there was also have a few questions in terms of how this COP has compared to previous COPs as well. So having been in Dubai and also in Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh, what was the feeling like at this COP compared to previous ones? And did it differ? How did it feel?
It was definitely different, and it was different in a few ways. I think when there was so much uncertainty at COP26 and COP27 about where would we end up on loss and damage, where would we, how would we land on particular things, and everything went to the bitter end. The fact that this COP started out with the funding, the capitalization of the loss and damage fund, for me sent a completely different signal, as much as it was surrounded in controversy because of a number of different things, right? An oil and gas state, the COP president, and all of these things. But for me, they started out the gate very, very strongly, indicating that this will be a different type of COP. I also think physically, because the infrastructure of this COP was physical, there was physical infrastructure. Normally, the entire infrastructure of COP has to be mostly constructed. That also made it very different in both good and bad ways. There was less wandering around, lost, discovering new things, which was unfortunate, but it was easier to get from place to place. Although once you left the venue, it was very, very time consuming to get to other events as well. But all in all, I felt that this was a very, very productive and very focused COP. And they started out by setting the tone and the fact that they would deliver. And this COP has delivered in spades.
No, absolutely. I know you mentioned a few of the developments that there's been so far, but I just wanted to touch on something as well. You were talking about the youth. You've been talking about the size of this COP as well. I think this was the largest COP in terms of attendance and delegates, and I think we're seeing that with the youth representation as well. But I know going into this, Caribbean civil society was speaking from shared talking points. So can you tell us a bit more about that and why it's important, especially on a stage like COP28?
Because one of the nice things about the COP process and the UN process is that it's, each nation has equal standing. And while, you always understand that the US has a lot of clout and the bigger nations have a lot of clout, the objective of the UN process is that each nation has equal standing. And with this one, the value that we have in speaking from the same hymn sheet has a lot of power. That movement on the tripling of renewable energy and doubling of energy efficiency, it was so startling to see the momentum it gathered just by virtue of the people who chose to sign and the momentum that it had and how quickly it made its way into the hands of the COP president. And he immediately started referencing the text from that letter signed by all of these people that just gave it so much weight. You could tell that he was vested in delivering at this COP, but also the fact that anytime we come together, whether it's the Caribbean, whether it's small island developing states, or whether it's all of civil society behind something meaningful, that it gives it momentum.
No, absolutely. And I think this actually feeds a bit into Kevon's question here. It's a two-parter. So the first one is, what is next then on the region's agenda as it relates to climate justice and action following COP28? What are the priorities?
Such a great question, Kevin. I'll tell you my personal priority. I think that the devil is in the details with a lot of this stuff. And you'll hear announcements made, but it's the follow through. It is following through to understand how does this actually manifest itself and what is the climate justice impact of a particular decision. So when you hear things like climate finance being operationalized for particular things, looking at, when the board is implemented on the loss of damage fund, who's on that board and what kind of autonomy do they have and what kind of ability do they have to act with speed, for example. And that for me is a climate justice issue. But also when we look at the investment funds that have been established and are circulating and the impact investment that's available, a lot of it is extraction, is capital extraction, it's value extraction. And we have to be very, very careful about how we allow ourselves to perceive the opportunities that exist. The Caribbean and small island developing states need investment, absolutely, but we need a lot more philanthropy. We need a lot more grant-based funding. And yes, we need to prepare ourselves to make sure that we're accepting the right kinds of funding for the things that we need in the ways that they make the most sense. But we also, from a climate justice standpoint, need to use local and regional capital where it makes sense to build our own capacity and accept external funding where internal funding cannot close those gaps. And for me, that is a huge part of how we change the dynamic in our execution of climate action in a just and equitable fashion.
Very good. And I think you've also touched a bit on the beginning of this second question, which was it would take some time for small island states to fully transition to renewable energy. So I think referring back to the agreement we saw earlier today, what can be done in the short to medium term to aid that transition?
I think it is getting the policy and regulatory framework in place. The fact of the matter is, for most small island developing states, it makes sense to transition to renewables. The major barrier is the upfront cost. It's a huge capital investment that's required to make that transition. And the strengthening of the grid, the making sure that we have battery storage where there's not like geothermal or hydro available. But it is making sure that we take a longer term view and we support our politicians who are by nature of their terms focused on short-term wins that we enable them to have long-term thinking. Because in order for us not just to survive, but to thrive, to reach our climate goals, we have to have long-term thinking.
No, very, very good. I know Rena's just also asked a question here. Various country ministers in the Caribbean have made it clear in various international groups that it is already difficult for developing countries to obtain grant funding when it comes to climate change and renewable energy. How will this change?
I think it will change through advocacy. You know, we have the Bridgetown Initiative, which I think is very, very clear about what is required and what kinds of funding we need. Also, access to concessionary loans for nations that are deemed high income. I also think that the more that we highlight the region, our climate smart map is certainly an opportunity as well, because it can show you where the vulnerabilities are and what the needs are, especially in those areas where only grant funding can serve to close the gaps. So that is what we hope to do. But it is about this continued advocacy on behalf of the region, raising our voices, making sure that we're heard, having one-to-one conversations with people on the ground, with citizens of the nations that we need to provide that grant funding, making sure that we enable their civil societies to support us in our desires.
No, very good. And a second question here, I think also following up on the European pollution tax, carbon tax. How will the organization, so the CCSA, help Caribbean countries to find strategies in dealing with the impact of pollution tax, for example?
How will we support Caribbean countries in dealing with the pollution tax? You know, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure that we have decided how we will support addressing that just yet. But ultimately, we believe it's the right thing to do, and we will support Caribbean countries in becoming greener. We think that it isn't a matter of just our survival or, you know, contributing to global mitigation, but our competitiveness requires that we are greener. And we have to take that seriously. So any support that we can provide in that transition, we will provide and encourage countries to work together. Any training or other solutions that we can provide to aggregate requirements so that countries know how to address it. We work really closely with the Caribbean Export, with Caribbean Association of Investment Promotion Agencies. And with them, we will find ways to help to green our solutions so that we don't lose any market access as a result of this new carbon tax.
Absolutely. I know collaboration has been the name of the game, I think, going into this COP. And over the years, we've seen a lot more. So obviously with the shared talking points that we covered earlier. And are there any projects right now that you've seen announced at COP or that have happened over the past year that we may have missed, specifically regarding climate and the Caribbean, that you'd like to share with us?
I don't think that there are any that you would have missed, but we're very excited about our climate smart agriculture that was launched in August that we mentioned in Anguilla, Barbados, and Cayman. And we're looking to see that expand over the course of the next year, always looking for donors that are willing to expand that to help us fortify and secure our food. That is a huge part, not just of our adaptation, but it can also be a source of our mitigation, because the CO2 that we spend on importing food is unnecessary. But as the climate crisis exacerbates, it means that there's more uncertainty in our food production. So definitely, I think expanding that program is necessary and something that we'd want you to watch. Certainly, we'd want to make sure that you are looking at the Climate Smart Map for opportunities that exist and the projects that exist across the region. I think a lot of times there isn't necessarily common understanding of what is happening. And as more projects, as you look at the map and you don't see projects that are already ongoing, let us know. You know, email us at hello@caribbeanaccelerator.org, and we'd be happy to add additional projects to the Climate Smart Map. It's important that we understand and we celebrate the progress that we're making toward the goal.
Absolutely. Kevin's just asked a question, but I very quickly want to follow up on the Climate Smart Map. But could you tell us a bit more about it and its applications? So it was obviously unveiled at COP28, but congratulations, by the way. But so can you tell us a bit more about how it's going to be helping the Caribbean?
Yes. So the Climate Smart Map, what it does is it pulls various parameters, all sorts of base information about Caribbean islands, and then you're able to layer that over many different things. So if you want to look at all of the countries with their NDCs and how much they've committed to renewable energy, and then how much renewable energy they've implemented, and that can help you to decide which of the countries that I want to target for a particular renewable energy solution. You can pull the map and look at what is the energy mix of particular Caribbean islands, and therefore determining where does it make sense to pursue geothermal, as an example. Which are the geothermal islands across the region? Which are the countries that import most of their food, which is most of the Caribbean, save for two countries? So I think it provides you with the challenge that we face in our region, which is access to data. The Climate Smart Map provides the data, and we're building it out, every day and adding new points of data. But it can allow you to create what we don't have, which are economies of scale, and use those economies of scale to determine whether you want to invest, whether you want to create a solution, whether you want to attract philanthropy. I think it's a great tool for the media to look at where things are or aren't happening, and to help you to keep people informed. So we are very, very excited about the ongoing development of our Climate Smart Map.
No, absolutely. And I'll get to Kevin's question as well, but I know you talked about briefly energy there. I know that there was also movement in the green hydrogen sector, specifically with geothermal. And would you want to talk a bit more about the green hydrogen plans in the Caribbean?
Certainly. So in the region, we have about 25 gigawatts worth of renewables that we have potential to create, which is far more than our internal requirement to just supply our energy needs. And what we need is to look at how do we make our pursuit of that renewable energy more cost effective. And that is by finding ways to create exports of that renewable energy, so that the excess renewable energy is wasted, but turned into something that we can market, turn into something that creates a new economy for us, but also turns into something that helps us to help the global north in climate mitigation, which is necessary for our survival. And that is green hydrogen. So you can take the green electrons that you get from making renewables and use that to produce green hydrogen or green ammonia. And that can be used in either air travel, it can be used in ocean travel, and it can also be used in industrial processes. We are at a wonderful transshipment point in the Caribbean, and our ability to produce and export this green hydrogen and participate in that developing market is key to our transitioning our own economies, rather than just being customers of the new solutions that are created, but we can also be sellers in that marketplace, changing the construct of the global economy as it stands today.
So staying ahead of the curve, essentially, right? So finding ways to
Definitely.
to build resilience within the regional economy. And this actually feeds into Kevin's question then, which was external shocks to the global economy often affect where funds go. As we've seen from COVID-19 pandemic, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and now the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now there is border conflict between Guyana and Venezuela. How do we make sure that the funding for climate change remains available despite these external shocks and geopolitical tensions? And is there any concern that worsening conflicts might affect access to funding for climate change mitigation, etc.?
That is such a great question. Oh my goodness. And yeah, of course, we're very, very concerned about it. But the way that we like to position it is that we keep fighting about the items on the table when the table itself is under threat. And we have to remember that and stay very, very clear about the fact that we can continue to fight about the pieces on the table, but if the table collapses, everything is gone. And not that we're looking toward that, because that if we focus on that, that's what we'll get. But we have to start thinking about how important is it that we get these fundamentals right, that we stave off the long-term threats versus focus on these short-term challenges. I know some of these issues have been long-standing, and they will definitely distract from access to climate funding without question. But we have to continue to advocate and to make sure that people remain focused, and we have to find ways of making climate change sexy. So we need to describe it in a way that's hopeful, that's optimistic, that's filled with opportunities, so that we don't allow ourselves to get forgotten.
Absolutely. I know we've got just on the topic of finding the financing available. There's obviously been also a lot of financing that's been announced at COP28. And like you said, making some of these topics sexier. Topics like agriculture, methane emissions, obviously renewables that we've discussed as well, and obviously loss and damage. So just because I think we haven't really talked about it much so far, but it did happen on the first day, and a lot of things have happened since. But can you tell us a bit more about loss and damage and its importance in terms of the Caribbean and financing overall? And then what do you see as being the next big negotiating topic from a finance standpoint?
Sure. So for the loss and damage, it is so important. The IMF produced a report that said that 40% of the global losses due to climate change are happening in our region. And that is significant. And we are economies that aren't sufficiently robust to sustain 40% of the global losses on climate change. So this fund for climate, for loss and damage is incredibly important for our region. But we've seen single events that have been 550 million, which was the first sort of tranche of funding announced on the first day. We're now at 792 million. But this fund needs to be in the billions quite easily. And how it's accessed and how difficult it is and how quickly it's mobilized are all fundamentally important. The first days following a disaster, and we're not even talking about just sort of sudden events. They're also slow onset events like drought and how that changes economies. So there's a lot for this fund to figure out. And I think all eyes are on this fund for additional capitalization and how it starts to distribute this money that it has amassed. And pledges, for people who aren't in climate action, to turn pledges into cash, that is not an easy process. That is it's not a set it and forget it process. Turning a pledge into cash is a time-consuming, long and arduous process. And the reality of the situation is we don't have the time. So we really do need to make sure that we keep the governments that have made these commitments accountable, that we are clear about what this funding is and that it is grant funding and not loan funding for loss and damage, and that we do the research so that we understand quite clearly what it means. And I think also as we talk about, any kind of climate finance, to your question, Vincent, that we disaggregate it, that we're clear on what is investment, what is debt, what is grant, because that makes a big, big difference in our ability to access it or our ability to absorb it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Cheryl, I don't know if there's, it'd be great if there's anything that you'd like to add or comment on.
Sure, thank you. Just on the access to finance, generally, I just really want to underscore your comments about the time frame and the work that it takes to move from the initial commitment to accessing the financing finally. And I think that's why the advocacy that you pointed to really is so important, and the continued work to keep the climate change as an agenda item for countries, for world leaders is so important. Certainly, there will be other crises that the world faces from time to time that may try to, at times, overtake those, the critical focus on climate change. But we really do need to take the opportunity to refocus and to refocus before there is another event to ensure that the mechanisms that have been outlined and that the commitments that have been made are actually translated into the supporting mechanisms that actually help our populations and help not just the Caribbean specifically, but certainly the global community when the next crisis arises. So we need to remain focused and proactive to ensure that all of the work that we do leads to critical support when it is needed.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. I know we've got two more questions now. One final one regarding the carbon tax. Just simply asking if there is any chances that Caribbean nationals will be affected by this carbon tax at all.
If I'm being completely honest, I think it is likely that we are impacted by this carbon tax. It's something that the European Union implements on importation would likely impact us. The good news is, when you look at our operationalization of the free trade agreement that we have with the European Union, we don't really access it very much. So it is an opportunity for us to use this new carbon tax to develop new products that we can then export to the European Union and open up, take advantage of the gaps that this would create for other economies. We can't produce at the same scale, but people aren't looking as much for mass-produced products. They're looking more for eco, green, and specialized and personalized solutions. So we have to start thinking ahead and being more proactive, looking at who is impacted and what are some of the substitute solutions and products that we can provide to fill those gaps. So this can happen to us in either way. This can either be something that prohibits us from accessing that market, or something that enables us to access that market. And I prefer it with the latter.
Oh, very good. Staying ahead of the curve, essentially. And I know we've got one more question here as well from Kevon. So can we get some details on how climate change is affecting women in the region specifically? What is being done to make sure that the effects on women and girls are being reflected in regulations and policies? And are there any specific projects ongoing or upcoming focused on gender and climate change?
I did not give him that question to ask, but I love it. So the impact of impact on women and girls on climate, the climate impact on women and girls is absolutely stark. We recently did some work with the Atlantic Council on looking at the impact and how we can address it. There are a few things that we can do. I mean, post-disaster, women tend to be more responsible for looking after family members. And so, accessing shelter tends to be a more acute for us than men. We're also more likely to be looking after children. So again, our ability to pack up and get to shelter is different. The vulnerability that women face in terms of sexual violence, in terms of violence in general, is higher. So we also have those things into consideration. We are more likely to be working in agriculture, and therefore, when the changes in weather patterns. So there's so many areas in which women are more impacted by climate change than men would be. We're more likely to have to work in lower income positions, which means that we have less cash flow available when a disaster strikes that will help us to either sustain our livelihoods or recover post-disaster. All of these things add up. And I think what we need to do and what we are focused on in our work with Atlantic Council is, one, having the data to highlight where women are more vulnerable so that we understand what that means, but also having more women at the table when decisions as to how these things are done is decided. Because if you don't have any women at the table, they aren't able to point out for you historic and inherent vulnerabilities that we face and potential solutions to address them. But more than that, we need to empower women, and we need to empower women by ensuring that we have greater access to leadership roles for women, and that when we provide climate funding, that we provide not just funding for issues related to women, that we provide funding to women-led organizations to address this gender disparity. Because we can continue to give the money to men to address issues related to women, or we can actually fund the women who are making these changes. So I think there are quite a few things that we can, should, and are doing.
Well, thank you very much for that answer, and thank you very much for that question. I think, Yvonne. So yeah, I have one last question for you. Going into 2024 now, COP28 has ended today. First of all, do you have any impressions or thoughts on this final draft text as it has come out? And then what are the plans heading into 2024 for both the CCSA and going into COP29? What are the priorities that we're looking for?
Okay, and before I get off my gender soapbox, we also have it as a cross-cutting theme in our project portfolio at CCSA, gender. And so we look at everything through a gender lens, as we think is necessary for all organizations working in this space. Yeah, so what are we looking forward to? Well, the work starts today. Today is day one of COP29. And the first thing that we are advocating for moving forward is access to more funding. So we definitely need to ensure that the relationships that we started and opened up during COP28, that we pursue those all through, and we're able to bring those to fruition before COP29. We'd like to see far more capitalization of the loss and damage fund, because that's really necessary. And we would like to help support more climate entrepreneurs in our region to access funding, whether through project preparation, whether through small grants, or whether through accessing different markets like the carbon markets through our work. So those would be the things that we are immediately focused on in the short term in leading up to COP29.
Brilliant. And your thoughts on the Dubai COP28 final decision, or final text rather?
You know, it was more than I expected, and global diplomacy is messy, and it's not perfect. We don't have like anybody who's in charge. The UN does the best that it can with the resources that it has, but the UN can't make anyone do anything. This has to be a consensus that we come to. And I'm really pleased with the outcomes of COP28. The proof is in the pudding and in the delivery. How do we deliver on all of these commitments? It's somewhat easy to commit. It's much harder to deliver. So I think our hope is, as an organization, and I know Island Innovation as well, to keep these organizations accountable, to keep these countries accountable, to measure what actually is implemented, so that we're not talking necessarily, or at least leading with, what are the announcements coming out of the next COP, but what are the things that were actually delivered, promised and delivered coming out of this COP, so that we have the momentum, that the wind is at our backs as we approach 2030.
A very good point. And Simon Steele also said that the COP28 agreement is a floor, not a ceiling. So, you know, it's something that we can all build on. And obviously, there have been quite a lot of positives coming out of it. So we discussed the financing, we've discussed things that have been happening in the Caribbean with the CCSA and the Climate-Smart Map, for example. But is there any final thoughts that you have, or any other projects that you would like to share for the assembled journalists and those who will be receiving the press packet to keep an eye on?
For us, the only thing that we haven't talked about significantly is how we want to support innovation. And I teased it a little bit, one comment or so ago. But we definitely need to see more innovation coming from our region and more willingness to stand up and be counted in creating new solutions. We recently completed our Earthshot nominations for, actually, I think we will finalize our Earthshot nominations relatively soon. But we had far fewer entries this time than we had previously. And what we need are more solutions coming from our region to help build our economic resilience. And that's what we'd want to see more than anything else. And we are willing to support organizations that come up with new solutions, nominate them for Earthshot and for other sources of funding, but also support them in their development. We also plan to provide a lot more self-help tools on our website that can help entrepreneurs to get from where they are to getting to the point of being ready to accept funding, which is a huge barrier in our region.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Racquel, and thank you also very much, Cheryl, for your input. And I think this will conclude our press conference. Thank you very much. And obviously, everyone who is here, you can find out more information about the accelerator at caribbeanaccelerator.org. And please feel free to reach out to us if you need any further information. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.